Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all here today. My name is Sylvia Barrett. I'm Director of Policy and Research at the National Charity Campaign for Better Transport, and I will be chairing the event today. We'll be talking about the future of charging for road use in London, and I'm delighted to have an esteemed panel for discussion today. In terms of introduction, we are all here today because we face the triple challenges, as the mayor has identified them, of congestion, air pollution, and the climate emergency. The mayor has launched a consultation on the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone and also the future of road user charging in London, which I'm delighted to have Cristina Calderato from Transport for London talk to us about today. The questions that we want to be considering with the fellow panelists as well is about what policy change and what campaigning needs to happen in order for more people to move more sustainably in London. So we know that electric vehicles will not be sufficient by themselves. If we only replaced all vehicles in London with electric vehicles, it will not be sufficient to meet our net zero objectives and to clean up the air. It's also well recognized with research that has been commissioned by the mayor that we also need to be reducing the overall amount of travel by private vehicles in London and shifting towards public transport, walking and cycling in order to clean up the air, to meet net zero objectives and to reduce congestion at the same time. So without further ado, I will pass on to the speakers today. And first of all, we have Cristina Calderato, Director of Transport Planning and Policy at Transport for London. And Cristina will be talking to us about what the mayor is proposing to do in order to tackle those challenges. Cristina.
Thank you. Everything froze momentarily for me. Hopefully that's all fine.
We're expecting the slides to start.
Sorry, my screen. Perfect. Okay, so first of all, it's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'll try and do these quite quickly so that I'm not spending too long boring you with PowerPoint and we can actually leave lots of room for discussion. But if we move on to the first slide, this just sets out some of the background and context to where we are now, which is that we know that we have done a lot in terms of trying to improve air quality in London, and we are making good progress there, but we don't meet legal limits and we've still got further to go, even with air quality. But that's not the only challenge that we're facing in London. And earlier this year, the mayor reaffirmed his commitment to London becoming a net zero carbon city by 2030. Now, just to drive home how ambitious that is, we had a zero carbon target by 2050, which was already challenging to meet. Bringing that forward to 2030 means that we really do have a lot to do in terms of reducing emissions from road transport in particular. And I think what the mayor commissioned Element Energy to undertake a report as to how we can meet this, what are the various pathways to that net zero carbon 2030 target. And the preferred pathway has identified that we'll need to reduce car traffic, so car vehicle kilometres, by at least 27%, which is a really kind of striking and challenging target and kind of sets the context of how ambitious we need to be. And so to address these challenges, we have been asked to specifically firstly, draw up proposals and consult on the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone to cover the whole of Greater London. So that's expanding from inner London to outer London. And then secondly, to develop proposals for the next generation of road user charging. So what's coming down the line? How can we simplify the kind of multitude of charges we already have into something that's simple, fair, that's easy for people to understand and use, and that also incentivizes more sustainable travel behaviour. So they're the two kind of prongs of activity that we're pursuing at the moment. So if we move on to the next slide, this one just sets out those triple challenges. I've already touched on some of these. So air pollution, we know of course about the very severe implications and consequences of air pollution on public health. And as I say, we've already introduced successful schemes in terms of reducing air pollutants, but we know that we need to go further. We've still got 16% of the Transport for London road network, which is exceeding legal limits for NO2. Nowhere in London meets the new World Health Organization guidelines for particulate matter. We need to keep going further and faster on air pollution. The climate emergency, as I say, I've already mentioned that we need to reduce car kilometres to 27% by 2030 if we're going to meet that net zero target. And I think it's just important to put in context as well that other sectors have decarbonised more quickly than transport. So road transport now accounts for a quarter of London's total carbon emissions. So a real particular need to go further in terms of reducing emissions from transport in particular. And then thirdly, not forgetting that traffic and congestion is also a daily irritant, which comes at a cost to people's livelihoods and hours lost spent in traffic as well. So individual drivers losing hundreds of hours per year in congestion, and there's a cost to the economy, the London economy, more than £5 billion of that as well. So we've been looking both at what we can do in the short term, and that includes those proposals for the Greater London ULEZ, but also looking at what we need to do longer term and being really clear that the ULEZ is a stepping stone to where we need to be in the future. We move on to the next slide. The impacts of air pollution. I think others will speak about this as well, but I think just to highlight some of the things that I know that people are already aware of here, but toxic air pollution in London is still the biggest environmental risk to the health of all Londoners. It harms our lungs, it worsens illnesses, lung conditions, heart disease, and we know about the very severe impacts it can have on children's health. The study from Imperial College, which you will have seen quoted elsewhere, says in 2019, over 4,000 Londoners died because of the impact of toxic air in London. So this is definitely not something that we can kind of rest on our laurels on or think that we've done enough. And I think when we've been looking at the proposals to expand, poor air quality has never been only a central and inner London problem. And what we see in outer London is that although the absolute concentrations of pollutants are lower, there is increase. So of those deaths, they disproportionately fall in outer London, and that's because of the higher proportion of vulnerable populations there, including elderly people. I think this just kind of, again, setting out the really clear need for action. If we can move on. What is TfL doing? Now, I don't want to spend hours talking about this and kind of banging our own drum or blowing our own trumpet, but I think the point of this is, I think that when we are talking about things like road user charging, it's recognising that these are difficult and challenging policies for many people, and they do have a big impact on the way people move around. And I think it's very important when we're communicating these changes to demonstrate that we're not just jumping to these policies, that we need to take a holistic view. We are very cognizant of that. We need to lead the way. We need to be investing in the alternatives. So in terms of our own fleet, we've got more than 800 electric buses. By 2034, we want that to be a fully zero emission fleet. To support that, we know that we need the right infrastructure in place so that key user groups can make that switch to electric vehicles. As Sylvia's already said, we know that that's not the answer. We don't just want to switch everything to electric vehicles. But for those drivers who do still need to be there, we want to make sure that they have the infrastructure they need to do it in the very cleanest possible vehicles. We've also we've licensed other vehicles. We've had zero emission capable licensing requirement for taxis. They now comprise over a third of the fleet. And then this last green box is really about what we need to do to invest in those alternatives to make sure that they are attractive, they're feasible, they're viable, people have confidence to use them, that they feel safe and secure to do so. So that's about training, it's about investment in infrastructure, it's about Safer Junctions programme, Green Person Priority, it's about making sure that we have the right alternatives in place so that we know we need to go further. That's likely to need some form of road pricing, but we want to be really clear with people that we're not jumping to that without the requisite kind of context in place, and that we are making sure that those foundations and the conditions are right. We can move on to the next one. Again, I won't dwell too much on this, but it gives you a sense of what we think we can achieve with the low emission zone. So on the right-hand side, you can see what the central London ULEZ delivered, and then on the left-hand side, how much further we think the further benefits that we think we'll get from a London-wide zone. So a further 9% reduction in NOx emissions from cars and vans in outer London. And when you think about the kind of scale of vehicles, the number of vehicles we're talking about in outer London, that's a really significant benefit. There's also a carbon benefit to that as well, reduction we think of around 27,000 tonnes. And that means that we think around 70,000 vehicles will shift from being highly pollutant to compliant with ULEZ standards. But also really importantly that 44,000 of those vehicles will be taken off the roads altogether, with people making more sustainable travel choices. And I think that's really where we want to be looking at longer term. So if we flick on again, I think this is just to kind of set the scale of impact in context. So we know that 82% of cars in outer London, so in that newly affected area, are already compliant and wouldn't need to take any action ahead of this coming in. And by August 2023, when the expanded ULEZ is proposed to be implemented, that would be up to 95% of vehicles. So fewer than 1 in 20 people, or around 1 in 20 people affected. So in terms of, I think, being conscious that there is a cost of living crisis, that there are other challenges people are facing, we've looked at the options, and this is one that has a really significant benefit, because even though you've got that large compliance, those remaining vehicles are so disproportionately polluting that there still is a really good emissions benefit, whilst limiting the amount of people who are impacted in the short term in terms of paying charges. There is a vehicle checker on the website, so everybody's able to make sure they know now whether they need to take action or not, and I think that's really important. If we can move on though, this is, I think, again, an important point, that particularly, again, thinking about the challenges that people face, we recognise that these policies are really ambitious, and that there can be particular challenges for some people in meeting the standards and in having or switching to a compliant vehicle if they do need to replace a vehicle. And so with the last expansion of ULEZ, we had a £61 million scrappage scheme, and that was targeted at the people that our impact assessments had highlighted as being disproportionately impacted. So disabled households, low-income households, small businesses and charities. And it's proposed that if we do move forward with another scheme, that there would be a further scrappage fund to support that. And again, I think it's just important to highlight that we would be trying to implement this in the most supportive way. If we can move on. Thank you. So this just kind of sets a context of where we are, kind of the timeline starting from where that first central London ULEZ was introduced through the expansion to where we are now in the middle of public consultation. And then you can see towards the right-hand side what we think will happen next. So in terms of that consultation, we are asking questions about the ULEZ expansion. So that's a kind of very specific part of the consultation. But I think it's really important not to just assume that, that this is something that's happening, it's the next iteration. We really need people's views on that as well, and to make sure that we're hearing views from a wide range of people, and not just those who will be impacted in terms of changing their car use or changing their car behaviour. But the other things that we're consulting on are trying to seek those views now early on what this next generation of road user charging should be. So what I don't want to do as a transport policy person is go, okay, we've been asked to do a London-wide ULEZ next year, we'll go away and beaver away on that, and then we'll return to this question of what we do next. We don't want to waste this time. We're starting with a genuinely kind of blank sheet of paper, and we have this time now to have a really good dialogue with stakeholders, with Londoners, to understand what they need to see from this next generation of road user charging. And so as part of the consultation, we're asking really 2 key questions, which is, what do we think the next generation of road user charging should be trying to achieve? What should the objectives be? Is it about toxic air, climate change, health and health inequalities, traffic and congestion? How important are these things? How should we be shaping that development? And then what things should we be considering in the design of a scheme? So what should it account for? Time of day, income? Is it the transporty things? Do we need to think about availability of alternatives? But really just trying to start that dialogue. And we're looking to have that scheme in place, that element energy report. I said, we need it in place by the end of the decade to meet that 2030 target. Sorry, I'm aware I'm probably running over. I'll quickly pick the last one, which just probably highlights some of this. So we know that we have done a lot to reduce air pollution levels, but we know that we've also got a lot more to do, which, facing these triple challenges, as I've set out, we really, really want to hear from people on this consultation. So I would really welcome views from everybody Today, it's really helpful for us to do these kind of events, to hear people's views. That helps me take everything back for us to consider whether we need to do anything in terms of modifications, but really encouraging people to feed back through that survey and that consultation portal as well. I'll call it a day there. Sorry for taking too long.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was excellent. And the thing to say at this stage is that us as organizations gathered here today, and London Friends of the Earth, who are hosting the webinar, are all supportive of the Mayor's plans going forward and the expansion of the ULEZ particularly, and would like to encourage as many of the attendees as possible to respond positively to the consultation. If anything, we want to be more ambitious, and what we want to discuss today is about how do we get that extension of the line, but also what are the next steps going forward, and what are the considerations on road user charging particularly. And just to be clear, we're talking about potentially distance-based road user charging in London with the charge variable or on a range of factors, as you mentioned, be that emissions or time of day, and so on. I think the options perhaps we can come to as part of the questions. Now, I would like to invite Rosamond Adukisi-Deborah, WHO Breathe Life Ambassador and founder of the Ella Roberta Foundation, to talk to us about the issue of air pollution particularly, and how you think the future of road charging needs to look like, and the role of that in addressing air pollution in London. Rosamond.
Hi, afternoon. I actually want to start by actually reading an actual factual thing that my advisor Claire gave me. And I think for me, I will always just look outside of my door and look at the South Circular. And I always use that as a measure. By the way, just to say, the facts I'm going to read to you, I'm not surprised, by the way. Since 2011, London has experienced a huge increase in the number of miles driven on its roads, rising from 19.1 billion miles in 2011, that's when my daughter was still alive, to 22.6 billion miles by 2019. That's an increase of 3.5 billion miles. And despite COVID, I'm sad to say, 18.7 billion miles were driven in 2020, despite lockdown. So that tells me the challenge of what's there, really. I think Christina has highlighted the impact on air pollution in health. And when I have very quiet moments, I always think, how much more can we raise awareness about the impact of air pollution on health? I'm going to give you a very practical reason why I said that. There was a rail strike last week, as we all know, and I'm not about to discuss the rights and wrongs of that. That's not my job. But it was very interesting. The moment they announced that, the first thing I saw the ordinary average person doing was ringing up a radio station and saying that the ULEZ should be suspended. That was the first thing they actually said. And I'm very glad the mayor resisted it. But the thing that told me is the reason why the ULEZ is there, people, average people, they must be missing why the ULEZ is there, because that was the first thing that they said. And I thought, but the roads will be more congested if you remove it. So what it does show to me, and all of us here, it shows that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. And since then, so that was one thing. And also last Friday, sorry, I apologize. I was part of an esteemed group. I was very lucky to get in to speak to the likes of Chris Whitty and all the top people in health. And the report, or what I would like to feed back to you, is everybody understands the impact of air pollution on health. So one thing I thought to myself, that's not where the campaigning really needs to be. The one thing I have always stressed to people in health, could they be as vocal as they can, because they have that respect. People trust their doctors, and we're pushing for things like leaflets to be in GP surgeries and hospitals to raise awareness amongst the public. So that's the second thing. Recently, I've had I have traveled a couple of times, and one of the things I do, it must be a nightmare to travel with me, because what I do when I go to other cities is I look at how their roads are, public transport is, and things like that. Then I come back and compare it to the UK or even London. We are miles behind, by the way. I noticed over there, scooters were on trains. So, and scooters are ridden by people of all ages. I actually did stare. I saw a very old couple riding a scooter, and it's just not something you will see in the UK. But I think the thing that fascinated me most is they actually took the scooters onto trains, and there was no one tutting at them or anything like that. People made way so they could travel with their scooters. There were bicycle on trains as well. Now, one of the cities I was in is Stockholm, which is a lot smaller than London. And I'm thinking, we are really going to have to change our mindset as well, if we are to conquer this. Because if London is a big city, and I have spoken to some enthusiastic cyclists who actually live on my road, and one of the things they said to me is London is very hilly compared to other places. So we have to accept that if people are going to use other modes of transport, they will need to get onto things like maybe the trains to support them on some of their journeys. Not also, I have to say, we are miles behind regarding infrastructure, and these things are very important to put. I think it is very good to, I went to Vienna recently, and I was very struck by trams, and I was also struck how everybody shared the actual road. But one of the things which was my concern is our roads here seem to be very narrow compared to some of the other cities which I visit. But I do think there needs to be a whole mindset. And I'll go back to where I started my campaign years ago. I actually haven't changed on that message. I think in a city like London, there's about 10 million of us. And what needs to be functioning and really well is public transport. Everywhere I go, public transport seems to be subsidized, and it's not in this country. And you know, when you look at a single bus, it can take 88 people. A cycle can take just one person or maybe two people, and younger people cycle. Some communities don't cycle. I still think the way around this issue is public transport, but it needs to be affordable. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be clean. And yes, people will still carry on driving, but I do think that is one way of getting people out of their cars. If you do nothing, a friend came to visit me and she went through central London one way, and it cost her over £7. And I said, pardon? That is really expensive with the cost of living. So where I am right now, maybe hopefully we are writing to the health secretary. And when I went on Twitter this morning, I was also looking at the amount of people that have cancer survivors. In my lifetime, I've noticed they're getting younger. And I do question one of the reasons why. So you see air pollution, you see health, it's linked to brain cancer and things like that. And there seems to be a bit disjointed. We talk about it here and everyone here. But my thing is, the message now needs to go further than us in this forum here. And my thing going forward is, what are we going to do to get the message out there to the masses? There's 10 million of us. Why am I saying that? And why? I'm not being negative. I looked at the government's response to the recent WHO targets. And I think if you take us in the movement out of it, very few people responded to it, very few. So for me, it is a worrying matter. And I'm going to end it by something Chris Whitty said, and I spoke to Claire about this, and he is a learned man. He is having a report coming out this September on air pollution. So that shows you how serious this topic is. But something he said, and I might write to him to get him to clarify it even more. He said some of the solutions for climate change are not the solutions for air pollution. And we all seem to be looking at, you know, when we talk about climate change, we talk about air pollution. So I'm very much looking forward to his report coming out, and that will be a moment as well. What I'm personally going to be doing going forward is when his report comes out, I am going to try and pressurize the government to have a public health campaign, because I believe this is what we need for the ordinary person. The mere fact that the moment there's a train strike, people say, let's suspend ULEZ, tells me the message has not dropped. So there are, I mean, I am one person, and I can see in here, there's about 60 other people. I think we all need to look at us in here, what else we can do to educate our fellow citizens in this city. It's brilliant we've got these things going on, but I'm now thinking we need to do more. The actual message needs to go out more. And I am going to continue to pressurize the government about a public health campaign. I do think that's going to help. But my concern is the amount of mileage that has been increased since 2011. And I don't know how much of that is down to fleet, because that's not my expertise. But yeah, where I live, I see more and more lorries. Forget even about private cars. I see more and more lorries heading to Dover. So it's something that concerns me. How we transport goods also is part of this. Does it need to be done by rail in future? I do think all these things are part of the solution. There isn't one thing. Also, all buses need to be electrified, and people write to me every now and then and say to me they are cutting the bus routes. Poorer people take buses, and therefore cutting buses can't be a solution to it. And I do think in order for us to have a massive change by 2030, all these things need to be considered. Otherwise, I think we're still going to be here in 2030 and talking about the same thing. I believe public transport is a resolution. People on here may disagree with me, which is fine, but I can't see how on earth we're going to move 10 million people round, really, unless the government decide to subsidize it. And I'll be really interested afterwards what people's opinions are about that. No, I'm not being negative. I'm just being realistic, because I realize, apart from the ULEZ, we are behind other countries right now. And that's the honest truth. We are behind other cities. They're being far more ambitious. And I think we need to be kinder, and we need to know that we need to share the roads. There's, you know, this whole thing about cyclists, you know, people trying to run them over, being really, no, we all need to share the roads, and we all need to be kinder. Otherwise, we're never going to solve this issue. So that's my contribution to this topic on transport.
Thank you so much, Rosamund. Yes, indeed, as a transport expert, I'm always surprised how low the awareness of the dangers of pollution still remains among the general public. And there's so much more that needs to be done on this topic. Obviously, us as campaigners are doing our bit, but I think that there's a bigger role that needs to be played by government, by local authorities and others. And I'm sure we'll touch on the availability of alternatives to the private car in the discussion. We are already halfway through the event. I will invite Ashok Sinha, CEO of the London Cycling Campaign, to talk about, you've spoken a lot about climate safe street, Ashok. My question is, what do you think is the role of road user charging and smart road user charging to deliver on the net zero ambitions by 2030?
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Before I go on, thank you to Friends of the Earth for putting on this event. Terrific, and it is a real pleasure and an honor to be on the same panel as such esteemed people as yourself and Christina and Rosamond. And shout out to Sylvia as well. It was in a chat. I think Rob from Centre for London put it in the chat. Sylvia didn't mention, but should have done, that she wrote one of the most important, or led the research and then wrote one of the most important pieces of work on smart and fair road user charging that we've seen in recent times while she was at Centre for London. The link is in the chat, I believe, so do have a look at it. We're in London Climate Action Week. That's why this event is being held. And I'm just going to, I'll spend a few minutes because we don't have much time, and we should spend as much time as possible on the Q&A, just trying to reinforce. I'm sorry if some people have heard me say this before, and apologize if I'm laying it on a bit thick, but just reinforce how little time we have left to get this right. So I remember maybe 30 years ago, a long time ago, when I was a young postdoc working on climate change, I was invited to give the occasional lecture to the public by the Institute of Physics on climate change. And I remember doing so, and people listened very, very intently, and I would say, look, this is a serious issue. Humanity is, the planet is warming. Humanity is activity, the burning of fossil fuels, is the single principal reason why this is happening. And they say, okay, yeah, maybe, all right, fine. But there was no sense that we were in an emergency. And I remember even just maybe 15 years ago when I was leading Stop Climate Chaos, I'd be in radio and TV interviews, and I'd be up against the climate change denier. And sometimes I was up against the interviewer as well, who were basically saying, yeah, all right, I mean, you guys, you're always telling us we're in an emergency. And actually, it never really happens. You're just crying wolf, right? Now, things have so seriously and thankfully moved on since then, especially since the Paris Climate Change Accord in 2015. So now almost everybody, and of course we thank David Attenborough and everybody else, the great and the good, for raising our consciousness and awareness. So almost nobody says anymore, okay, we're not facing a climate emergency or a threat from a changing climate. But my fear is that we are moving, and this has been well trailed and well discussed by many more eminent people than me, moving from a situation of climate denialism, climate change, climate emergency denialism, to complacency. And one of the words that Alok Sharma, who I do have time for, as president of COP26, it was a tough gig in Glasgow, really tough gig. He tried his best, as did so many people. He refers to, and he referred to the climate emergency at the opening event of ELCOR on Monday as a chronic problem. And he says this again and again and again. It's not. The climate emergency, the ecological emergency, the fact that humanity is not living within our planetary boundaries is an emergency. It's not something that we can think about next week, next year, next decade. Now, without minimizing the suffering that people have experienced from things like pandemics, those are chronic issues in a sense. Pandemics come, they go. I know lots of people suffer, I know, but humanity still exists. From the perspective of civilization itself, this is an existential crisis. I don't think humanity is going to become extinct, but let's remember what we are dealing with, and there are no second chances. Let's remember what we are dealing with if we do not keep the climate emergency, global warming, climate heating, within the 1.5 or maybe 2 degrees C average warming of the planet. What are we facing? We're facing a situation where most of the planet, or large swathes of it, will be essentially uninhabitable for the human species. Think of the consequences of that. Hundreds of millions of people losing their lives and livelihood, hundreds of millions of people looking for somewhere safe to live. All of the peace and insecurity problems, the wars that come with it, democracy will not survive. The carrying capacity of this planet will be greatly diminished, and it will be a very, very dark place, and there'll be no coming back from that situation, right? So let's remember that when we're having these sorts of conversations, but let's also remember, because none of us do what we do because we're harbingers of doom and gloom. We do what we do because we know that through the modus and through the mechanism of decarbonization, through the imperative that comes from creating a zero carbon city, we're going to address so many of those other problems that we've known about for decades, but we never got around to fixing. Why are people still living in drafty, damp houses that are so badly energy inefficient, when we've known since the 70s and the first oil crisis that we have to address energy efficiency? We can create streets where our kids can play out again. I'm old enough to know and remember the time when my parents didn't worry where I was just out there playing. We don't live in that kind of world anymore. We can change that again. We can create a situation where the kids who are growing up in London today have got good long-term career prospects because they are going to be working in clean tech, in renewable energy, and sustainability, in a better way of organizing our society and economy where we live within planetary boundaries. We can protect the global commons, the natural world around us, protecting biodiversity. We've lost so many meadows, we've lost so many wildflower species, pollinators, our wetlands in retreat. This will all have a big impact on our capability to exist and survive as a civilization. We can protect all of that and enrich it for future generations and conserve it for future generations. So there's so many things we can achieve around this decarbonization, and I would also say circularization, so zero waste economy agenda. So that's the prize. And if we get it right, wow, it'll be historic transformation for humanity. So what about transportation in all of this? Okay, let's get down to some specifics, and apologies for some numbers, but you saw them in Christina's presentation, which is going to go around. Now, we are in a situation where, as Christina said, transport is the single biggest element of our carbon emissions, and it's been stubbornly flatlining those carbon emissions. Other areas we've done really, really well, like, I mean, some areas. Heat is another question, but particularly in power, we've done well in terms of decarbonisation. But transport's stubbornly high and the highest single part of our carbon emissions, and road transport is a single element, biggest element within that. Now, the mayor has quite rightly set a target for London to become net zero by 2030. Okay, just hold that thought for a second. What does that actually mean? And this is where I have some concerns and reservations. That actually means a 78% reduction in carbon emissions, leaving 22% of our carbon emissions come 2030 that we still are going to have to offset in some way. I am sure I'm not the only person in this call who's feeling a little bit skeptical about that. But nevertheless, 78% reduction of carbon emissions is really, really big. And it's important we do that. Fundamentally important that we achieve that. So how are we going to do that? Well, I can see, and we had this campaign, and still running it, Sylvia mentioned it, called Climate Safe Streets, where we're calling for a full decarbonisation of our London's road system. We did some work, and we can't see any way that that can be achieved unless there is a really, 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 really big shift from private motor car use to walking and cycling and public transport. And something else we haven't really talked about yet today, shared mobility, because nobody's saying that a motor is unnecessary in London. You know, I've got a 91-year-old mother. Of course, a motor is necessary at London at certain times. But do we have to have so many private motor cars? Do we have to have so many private motor car journeys? 3 million journeys are made by private motor car every single day that are short enough and don't involve the movement of sufficient luggage to be able to be cycled and sometimes walked, right? Why is that happening? So we're only going to achieve that 27% reduction in vehicle kilometers that Christina has rightly said we need to deliver in order to help achieve net zero by 2030 if there is this mass mode shift away from private motor car use to walking, cycling, public transport and shared mobility. But how do we get that? Well, we got to look at the supply side, yes, but we also got to look at the demand side. Supply means high quality cycle lanes, reallocation of road space and priority on the roads towards cycling, more and better public transport, especially buses. Rosamund is absolutely right. We're going in a completely the wrong direction. I'll come back to this in a second on buses. Not because TfL wants to go in the wrong direction, but there are other reasons. Absolutely fundamental. Again, reallocation of road space towards buses. Shared mobility. Why have we not got a plan to provide every Londoner easy access to shared e-scooters, shared e-bikes, shared EVs, so that by come 2030, people have access to that motor on an on-demand basis when they need it. But even then, even if we provide all of that facilitation, the supply side, we've also got to look at the demand, because we'll only get that total vehicle kilometerage reduction if we also reduce demand. How do we reduce demand? Well, the single most important tool that we have available to us is road users charging, and it has to be smart and fair. Smart being it can vary in time and space, so that if people are driving when it's particularly congested, when the air pollution levels will therefore be very high, the charge is higher. If people are driving at other times, or to incentivize them to drive at other times, the charge is lower. But it also has to be fair, because we're all aware how much people are suffering in London from the cost of living crisis. And actually, London had some of the UK's most poor and disadvantaged communities anywhere, which is worth remembering when we talk about levelling up. I heard somebody the other day, a government minister, saying wealth must be transferred from the south to the north. Hold on, some of the people who are most deserving of something positive, constructive coming out of this levelling up agenda live right here in London. And let's not forget that. So it has to be a fair means. And I'll leave that to the policy wonks. There are people who are much better capable than I am to determine how to build fairness into the system, but fairness has to be built into the system. But from where I am sitting, there is, and I don't wish to sound like a politician from several decades ago, from where I'm sitting, there is no alternative. It is potentially the single most important policy tool that we have available to us to achieve the shift in the way we move around London towards cleaner, greener ways of doing it, and healthier, because it'll improve public health, is smart and fair road user charging. And my real fear, actually, sorry, I'm using up some time. I'm really quick now. Another thing that Andy Byford, Commissioner of TfL, said to me the other day, it also means that the cost of the other interventions, like making junctions safer for people walking, are lower because you have to deal with fewer traffic flows. So there's a cost advantage as well, and TfL gets more money to provide those alternatives. But it is the single most important policy tool that we will have available to us, and there has to be a compact. Rosamond is right, there has to be a compact. If people are going to be charged, they have to have the alternative. They're going to be told, right, try not to use the car, it's going to cost you, and give up that private car because you can always access a shared car if you need it. There has to be the provision of the alternative. But to your point, Rosamond, until the government realizes that putting the squeeze on TfL for what seems to me to be ideological reasons is completely counterproductive, even for achieving its own carbon reduction targets. And the Committee on Climate Change said yesterday we only have a plan for addressing 2/3 of our carbon emissions. We're 1/3 off plan. Then it makes sense to support public transport, walking and cycling in London. And my fear is that the whole issue is toxic with the public and will be toxic with the public unless we can say, all of us to the public, yes, you're going to be charged if you use a private motor car, but if you don't, and maybe even give up the private motor car, wow, we've got a great suite of solutions for you to use instead. Convenient, cost effective, and enable you to have a better life and a better city and better quality of life for everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Ashok. Thank you. You certainly put it in very stark terms, what's at stake here and how quickly we need to be addressing this issue. The three broad areas I want to discuss before we close. We've got 15 minutes. First of all is design and timeline. Second one is mitigations and the fairness aspect. And the third one, how do we build acceptance among the general public and the politicians? And I think all those areas will cover most of the Q&As that I've seen coming so far of the audience questions. Christina, can I come to you first in terms of the design and the timeline for smart road user charging? Obviously, the consultation document was quite brief on that. What is the current thinking on the options? And thanks to Rob at Tfl London for mentioning the report that I did in 2019, Green Light, that set out the option for distance-based charge variable by emissions, by availability of alternatives, which I think is very, very important. You cannot charge the same rate in inner and outer London. And perhaps time of day and whether that's an essential issue, that's a consideration. But another thing I want to point out, I can see from the chat discussion about national road pricing as well. And at Campaign for Better Transport, we're currently got a project on national road pricing, which is for taxation purposes and quite different from local road user charging, which is about mitigation of air pollution, congestion, and carbon emissions, which is what we've been talking about today. But Christina, what's the current thinking at TfL on the options for road user charging and about the timeline? I think the current discussion is about within the next decade, within this decade, but how quickly can we progress on this?
Yeah, I'm pleased because I was pulling the themes out of the Q&A as well, and I've got all the same ones as you, so that's that's good. So in terms of timing, so from some of those questions, you know, a bit of frustration that we can't just move quickly and go straight there. And I think a kind of gentle pushback on that is that this is something that is different. It's going to take a bit longer to put in. It's going to take longer to design and develop. The enforcement of it is going to be different and new and require different types of technologies. And so that will just take longer than expanding a scheme which has already got infrastructure and kind of back office systems in place. And so I think what we've tried to set out by doing this kind of single consultation is that that's what we want to do, and we want to start working on it now, and we want to like do this as quickly as we can starting from now. But equally, we don't want to just wait for that. We need to do something more quickly, particularly in terms of air pollution. And so we're doing ULEZ more quickly as well. But that's not as a kind of stopgap to buy time, if you like. It's because we want to make progress quickly as well as progressing the next generation stuff. So in terms of the timeline, we've got this consultation now. That's going to help us understand some of the things you were just talking about in terms of the variables that we should be considering and what some of those kind of fairness aspects of it should be. So I think one of the things that's really important is that we do now have, you know, a politician, the mayor, who has said, we need distance-based charging. We need this. And I'm committing that we need to have it in by the end of the decade. And I know that might sound further away than some people's ambitions would like, but it's still a really bold statement for a politician to make when we know that that's been difficult in this area. So I think we need to welcome that, and the fact that we are publicly consulting on it is we are having this conversation, you know, publicly and trying to engage people on it. So I think that's really positive. So the next step is for us to do this kind of design and development phase informed by what we get through consultation. One of the other questions that was in there was about, you know, how we thought about charging by vehicle type. That's one of the things we'll be considering as well. Should freight be charged more, or should freight be charged less? Because that's the essential traffic. These are some of the kind of areas we need to work through. But I think, you know, vehicle type, time of day, emissions, area, distance, and then it's what else should it be? Should we also be considering household income in the design of a scheme, or do we need to think about what are the right discounts and exemptions? Are discounts and exemptions still the right way to mitigate impacts on people, or should we be looking at things like credits or mobility credits? And I think that's something as well that draws on some of the other comments that are in there about, you know, a national scrappage scheme. Yes, that would certainly be helpful. In the absence of that, we are developing our own. And I should have said more actually when we're looking at how we might design a scrappage scheme for this potential ULEZ expansion. We want to have a much enhanced third-party offer. We had some last time. We had something with Zipcar. We had some free cycle hire. What we want to do this time is make sure that we have the most compelling package of alternative offers, so that when you're at the point of giving up a vehicle and getting that £2,000 for a car, at that point in time, we're able to say to you that £2,000 will go further if you're using it on buses, if you're using it to cycle, if you're using it to use shared mobility. So that is something that's absolutely central to our thinking on that now, and will be part of how we think about this future development as well. It's very hard to put a specific timeline on the next generation work, but I think that we're kind of at a point we think it is some years from being ready. Do I think it will be as late as 2030? No. Can I tell you how many years beyond 2023? Probably not exactly. But that's why we want to start from where we are now. We want to start this work. We want to start engaging. We want to get the feedback. We want to start the development. We want to be able to test that with people. We want to be able to understand the impacts of it so that we can actually move forward and start progressing through this to actually implementing a scheme, which has always been 10 years in the future. Let's bring that forward. Let's get it to a point where we can actually get it in on London streets.
Thank you, Christina. And I think the thing to add, which I forgot to mention, is that a new scheme would be replacing the current congestion and ULEZ schemes. And I think that has the potential to be much fairer and potentially cheaper for some people that might be driving less than long distance journeys.
The balance between the fairness of driving less without incentivising the short journeys, which we know make up such a large proportion of the traffic. So yeah, complicated, but we're pleased to be grappling with those challenges.
Perfect. And pleased to hear about the option for enhanced third-party offers in terms of the availability of alternatives. I guess the question is, would that be only available for the people that qualify for the scrappage scheme, or will it be available to more people as well?
So in terms of the ULEZ proposals, we're looking at it in terms of the scrappage scheme. So again, we've almost got kind of two prongs for this work. The first is, what can we do for 2023 as part of a scrappage scheme to support people when they're making vehicle choices about a ULEZ expansion? And the second is, how do you build this into the design and development of that longer term scheme? So the first would be kind of scrappage centric, the second not necessarily.
Lovely, thank you so much. In terms of the mitigations, that I think we already touched quite a lot on the alternatives that people need to have available. I think that there was a question about, is the mayor planning a campaign about what the options are about the need to move to electric vehicles if you can, and use alternatives? What are the engagement plans for this?
So the mayor a couple of years ago put together an electric vehicle infrastructure task force. It was hugely positive. So it brought together for the first time people from all aspects of this debate. So users, infrastructure providers, I'm not going to remember them now, but the energy sector, charge point operators, public sector. Like it was a really kind of big holistic group of people, and we held numbers of workshops with literally hundreds of people. It was a really good solid piece of work, and that was looking at what the infrastructure needs would be to 2025. We've recently revisited that and have a proper EV strategy now. And so what we've been doing within that strategy is identifying the key user groups, because we want to make sure that we're just focusing on the people who really need to drive. So business, freight, taxis, PHVs, car clubs, thinking about the essential traffic, making sure that we are engaging particularly with them and making sure their charging needs are met. But I think we also need to just be conscious that we're not trying to just move from where we are now with combustion powered metal boxes, with everyone keeping the same number of metal boxes, but now they're powered by electricity. So we're really trying to focus on key user groups and essential traffic. But that strategy was published last year, and we can provide links and stuff to that if that's useful.
Thank you. And just briefly on the fairness point, I think Ashok mentioned that, but do you have any thoughts at this point about how, well, you mentioned that scheme design is to come, but what do you think in terms of the poorest households and how we can target those specifically?
Yeah, so I think this is a really key focus moving forward. And I think what's been interesting, even just looking at the ULEZ expansion, is actually when you're looking at central London versus inner London versus outer London, there are really different, big differences there, both in terms of availability of alternatives, household access to car, the different types of journeys people are making. And actually in outer London, it's a different beast. And I saw one of the comments was that, they were surprised by the high levels of compliance because it doesn't necessarily look like that on the street. And so I think there is, when you're looking at London-wide schemes and looking at replacing stuff that's already there, I think you've referred to this already in terms of the availability of alternatives, but actually we've got lots of different characteristics in different parts of London, and looking at how that all feeds into the proper design of the right level of charges for the right, taking into account household income, the types of trip those people are making, the types of alternatives they have, is going to be really key. And as I say, so it's thinking about whether that's discounted rates, whether it's proportions or credits for trips, whether there are different ways that you can do that. And I think part of what's really valuable about this consultation, and really welcome as many views as possible, because we are trying to do something really new and different, and there are going to be lots of challenges to overcome. So if people have views on this, please, the more responses to consultation we can get, the better, because we want to do this in the best, most supportive way we can, while still being impactful, and welcome all views on that, really.
Thank you. I think all of us here today are very energized to respond in
please
as much
do
detail as possible. Rosamond, do you have any thoughts on how we can increase acceptance among the general public? As we heard, telling people to drive less is a very contentious topic. How do we increase that awareness of why we're doing this? What are the dangers of pollution and climate change? But also for people to understand that it's their own behavior that will make the difference. Do you have any thoughts on how we should be doing that?
That's my that's my battle. I think the first thing we're thinking about is getting ULEZ over the line. And Christina, I think it's ingrained in us as a society. I've just been reading people's comments. That's what I was doing, and you know, the other day, someone was driving the most enormous Range Rover ever. And I must admit, it's not a jealousy thing. I just don't really get it, basically. But then we are taught, aren't we? They're kind of wanting more, flaunting wealth. This is all part and parcel of it. There's no point us sitting in this thing and saying people need to not do SUVs, and when the government is forever pumping them out, churning them out. I think we need to make a decision as a society where on earth we are going with all this. We are really going to have to, by the way, because whilst we're all talking amongst each other, the government continue to advertise. They basically say to families now, these cars are, I don't know, I've seen them on Channel 4 adverts or all commercial stations. These new cars are, they actually target families and say, these are the cars you need to buy in future. They are enormous. They have enormous power, and they're putting out all the adverts. There's a very good reasons why adverts are so expensive. They make people want things. So I tend to blame the public actually less. Hence, I have been trying to fight since Ella's inquest for there to be a public health thing about air pollution. The government still have not agreed to it. So it is an enormous, I think, awareness, but where is the awareness? You can't have one person do it. You need someone up there who's going to say, right, time's up. In order for us to meet our targets at 2030, we need to reduce car use by this. I don't see any sign of it, by the way. And we all know about tire and brake wear. And yeah, electric vehicles, and someone put on there, they are 20K. So that tells me they are marketed towards certain type of people. And the average person right now won't be able to afford it. I think we as a society, and we are led by government and the people in charge, I will continue to push them. I mean, they haven't said no to a public health campaign, so I've got to be very, very truthful about that. Let's see whether they actually go for it. But until that changes, otherwise we just look like these people who are trying to spoil everyone else's fun, rather than, if it stems from government, they can talk about the detrimental impact of air pollution and climate change. That is a whole different ballgame. But may I remind everybody, this is the same government that, you know, might be planning on opening coal mines again and things. So it's a constant battle. We sort of move forward a bit and then we kind of move backwards. We go forward a bit, then we move backwards. I don't have all the answers anymore. That's why I'm sticking to public transport, because at least if that was subsidized or cleaner or more reliable, we will get more people. If you don't offer people an alternative, then not a lot is going to happen. I was very shocked by the amount of mileages in increase, 3.5 billion. So that is a lot of cars indeed. So something is not quite going right. We have more awareness, but the hard facts are telling me something else. So I'm going to say, you know, a health campaign by the government. The government need to buy into this, and I can see why they are reluctant right now. I can, but we do need to change our ways. And I have to accept as well, we as British, we are fair weather cyclists, aren't we? It might not be popular to say that, but being in Europe recently, they have a completely different attitude to things, to scooters, but we need to change the way we view things and stop viewing people as a nuisance. You know, look at that greenie going over there. This is something that we all need to embrace. And I don't think we are there yet. And someone mentioned freight. I don't know what Christina thinks is the answer to that. But having lorries upon lorries upon lorries blocking up the South Circular going to Dover, please, can TfL come up with something else?
Thank you, Rosamund. Yes, lots of things to consider. And the politics of it, I think that's a whole other discussion that we need to have separately. But Christina, just before we wrap up, there were quite a few questions about the role of local authorities in terms of reallocating space and parking and also supporting the move towards distance-based road charging. Just a sentence or two on that, if possible, before we wrap up.
Yeah. So working really closely with local authorities, and of course this consultation has actually been a really good opportunity to, have some very tangible things to engage around in terms of what the future is, what we need in terms of air pollution, but more broadly, how could something new work? So in terms of parking, low traffic neighbourhoods, all of those things, I think we recognise that during the pandemic, lots of things had to happen very quickly. We are now working together really closely to make sure that we implement things in a way that make sure the benefits are really clear and people can experience them and feel them, and bringing communities along with us as well. So working closely with local authorities.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Ashok, any final thoughts before we wrap up on any of the questions that were raised by the
I'm just going to I'll try to be as quick as possible because people are leaving quite rightly. There was one question that said, it's an interesting point. Do we change social norms or do we change behavior? We do not have time to simply put options in front of people and say, go choose. We don't have time. We have to channel that. How do we channel that? I think we have to change social norms. We're not in a dictatorship, but we do need to achieve change at pace. So it means changing social norms. How do we change social norms? Well, that's a massive question. But I think people will go to a place if that place is attractive. And we have to make the destination of all of this attractive. So when we talk about fairness, it's often, oh, how can we mitigate the negative impacts of road charging? No, fairness means having clean air. Fairness means the 50% of Londoners who don't have access to motorized transport already, as well as everybody else, having a decent, clean, efficient, cheap transport system. Fairness means future generations not having to live with climate change. Fairness means kids being able to play out. So let's have a conversation about fairness and a fair society and a good society and a better society. And it just takes enough of us to get into that and get behind it, and social norms will follow, making the difficult political choices easier. Well, that's a theory anyway.
Thank you so much, Ashok. Brilliantly said, and an excellent point to end up on. Apologies to everyone with questions in the Q&A that we couldn't bring in. There was just...
Happy to listen.
So we could talk about this for another hour, I'm sure, and we'll make sure that questions are considered, and we'll try and get answers to you in writing. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Brilliant discussion. I think that it just underscores how much more there is to do on all this. I am, however, positive. I mean, if there's one city in the UK that can do this, I'm sure London can do this, but it will take a lot of effort from all of us here and from people on the ground. So we look forward to keep working together with Transport for London and the Mayor. Thank you very much to all the panelists today for your brilliant contributions, and for the attendees for your excellent questions. Thank you also to Friends of the Earth London for hosting this discussion, and I look forward to speaking together again soon. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.